I checked the pressure readings on my console again. The numbers showed the stability of our operation. 3,000 feet beneath the ocean's surface, even the smallest miscalculation could kill us all. As chief engineer of Poseidon 7, I took pride in being thorough. Our underwater drilling platform was our life support system. While the rest of the 16-person crew focused on extraction quotas and mineral samples, my job was to ensure we stayed alive long enough to collect them. Through the viewport beside my station, I watched the drill boring into the seafloor. The mechanical arm extended from our habitat's base module, pushing deeper with each rotation. Floodlights illuminated the work area, creating a bubble of visibility in the darkness. Sediment swirled around the drill like an underwater dust storm. "Mike, got a minute?" Grace Leonard stepped through the sliding door into the engineering bay, her tablet displaying colorful geological readings. As our senior geologist, Grace had an eye for anomalies that most people missed. "What have you got?" I asked, turning from the viewport. Grace stood next to me and held up her tablet, pointing to an area of particular interest on the scan. "These density readings are unusual. Look at this section, 30 meters below our current position." I studied the data, immediately seeing what concerned her. The screen showed a clear, hollow space, a cavity of some kind directly in the path of our drilling operation. "Could be a gas pocket or an underwater cave system," I said, taking the tablet to examine the readings more closely. "Either way, we should adjust our approach. If we punch through into an unstable cavity at our current pressure and speed, we risk a blowout or structural collapse." Grace nodded. "That's what I thought too. The surrounding rock composition is consistent with..." The door slid open again, cutting her off mid-sentence. Drew Vega, our operations director, walked in with his ever-present tablet tucked under his arm, his expression already telling me I wouldn't like what he had to say. "Please tell me you're not suggesting another delay, Ford." Drew didn't bother with greetings. "Corporate headquarters called again this morning. They want increased yield by end of quarter, which means we need to push harder, not ease up." I gestured to Grace's readings. "We've got an anomaly directly beneath us. 30 meters down, there's a cavity of unknown size. We need to adjust our approach angle and reduce pressure." "And how long will that take?" Drew asked, crossing his arms. 6 hours minimum to recalibrate and reposition. Another 4 for test bores at the new angle." Drew shook his head. "Unacceptable. We're already behind schedule." "You remember Atlantis 3? I asked quietly. The question hung in the air. Drew's expression hardened, but I held his gaze. 14 people died on Atlantis 3, I continued, because warnings about underwater pressure variations were ignored. They pushed their drill straight into a methane pocket. The entire habitat imploded. Drew's jaw clenched. The disaster had happened just 3 years ago, and everyone in our industry knew the details. He glanced at the pressure readings on my console, then at Grace's tablet. "Show me the data again," he said finally. Grace took him through the readings, explaining the density anomalies and potential risks. I added details about necessary safety protocols and the adjusted drilling approach I wanted to implement. After several minutes, Drew let out a long breath. "Fine. 10 hours, not a minute more, and I want hourly progress reports." "You'll get them," I promised. After Drew left, Grace gave me a small nod of appreciation before returning to her lab. I called Roger Stevenson and Stephanie Henderson to the engineering bay to brief them on the situation and begin implementing the adjusted protocol. Roger arrived first, his tool belt jingling as he walked. "Another corporate versus safety showdown?" he asked, spotting the recalibration commands I was entering into the system. "Something like that," I replied. Stephanie joined us moments later, immediately reviewing the density readings without being asked. That was what I appreciated about her. Thorough and no wasted words. Cavity looks substantial, she said. Smart call on the adjustment. The three of us spent hours recalibrating the drill, adjusting the angle, and modifying pressure settings. When we restarted the operation, I felt the vibrations travel through the habitat as the drill ground through rock and sediment below us. I watched the numbers on my console, tracking every change in pressure and stability. The adjustment would work. It had to work. But as Poseidon 7 shook with each rotation of the drill, I felt uneasy. We were still drilling into the unknown, just from a different angle. I looked back at the viewport, watching sediment clouds swirl around our equipment. Here, mistakes meant death. Despite the protocol change, I kept one hand near the emergency shutdown controls as the drill inched closer to the cavity beneath us. I felt it, first in my hands. A subtle change in the drill's resistance that traveled up through the control panel at exactly 14:22 hours. The indicator needles dipped suddenly, and a heartbeat later, pressure alarms screamed across the engineering bay. "Stop the drill! Pull back now!" I shouted into my comm unit, my fingers already flying across the emergency protocols. The drilling team responded immediately, but I could tell from the readouts that we'd breached something. Full stop. Repeat, full stop. The habitat vibrated around me as ancient seawater surged through the opening we'd just created. On the monitoring station, red warning lights flashed in rapid sequence. I pulled up the exterior camera feeds, switching to the drilling site view. The floodlights cut through the darkness, revealing what looked like a massive dark cavity beyond our breach point. "Mike, are you seeing this?" Grace's voice came through my headset, tension evident in her tone. "I see it," I said, adjusting the camera angle to get a better view. "We've broken through into some kind of underwater cavern system." Nova Yang burst into the engineering bay, her tablet already displaying data streams from our sensors. Her eyes were wide with excitement rather than the concern I felt coursing through me. "This is amazing." She hurried to my station, pointing at the camera feed. "Look at the walls. They don't match the surrounding rock at all. This could be an isolated ecosystem, untouched for millions of years." "It's a massive breach in our drilling line," I countered, pointing to the pressure readings. "We need to seal it and reassess before—" The door slid open again, and Drew stepped in, already assessing the situation with quick, calculating eyes. "Status report," he demanded. "We've breached an underwater cavern during drilling operations," I explained, indicating the feed. "I'm working on stabilizing pressure and sealing the breach." Nova turned to Drew, her excitement evident. "We have to investigate this. An isolated ecosystem at this depth could have unknown biological specimens." I shook my head. "Too risky. We don't know what we're dealing with here. The structural integrity—" "Can we deploy a remote submersible?" Drew interrupted, looking at Nova. "Absolutely," she replied before I could object further. "The compact Explorer unit is prepped and ready. We could have visual confirmation within minutes." "Do it," Drew ordered, ignoring my frustrated expression. "Drew, I strongly advise against this until we've properly assessed the—" "Your objection is noted, Mike," he interrupted, his tone final. "But we have a unique opportunity. The submersible is designed for this type of exploration." I clenched my jaw as Nova rushed to the auxiliary station to prep the submersible launch. Within minutes, the small exploration unit detached from its dock beneath our habitat and moved toward the breach. The main display switched to the submersible's feed as it approached the opening we'd created. "Entering the breach now," Nova announced, her fingers dancing across the controls. The entire engineering bay fell silent as we watched the feed. The submersible's lights penetrated the darkness, revealing a vast chamber that extended far beyond what our sensors had initially detected. The water inside was strangely clear, lacking the sediment clouds that typically accompany drilling operations. Temperature reading is consistent with deep ocean water, but the mineral composition is unusual, Grace said, analyzing the incoming data, almost like it's been filtered somehow. Look at those formations, Nova whispered, directing the submersible deeper. They're unlike anything in our geological surveys. The unease in my gut grew with each meter the submersible moved forward. This cavern felt wrong, too perfect, too preserved. I checked the oxygen levels in the water. They were higher than expected at this depth. Remy Oliver had joined us silently, standing behind Drew with his arms crossed. His security training had him scanning everything with professional scrutiny. "There," Remy said suddenly, pointing to something at the edge of the submersible's lights. "Movement at 2 o'clock position." Nova adjusted the camera, focusing on what appeared to be a collection of fossilized remains embedded in the cavern wall. Large, segmented shapes that looked almost like... The fossil twitched. "Pull it back," I said immediately, my voice low and urgent. "Pull the submersible back right now." "Wait, I need to get closer," Nova protested, zooming in the camera. "That's not a fossil," I insisted, my voice rising. "Nova, get that submersible out of there now." But it was too late. As we watched in horrified silence, what we had mistaken for ancient remains unfurled itself from the cavern wall. A massive arthropod with an armored exoskeleton that glinted in the submersible's lights. It had 8 jointed legs that extended from its body segment, and 2 enormous front claws that dwarfed the rest of its body. "That's a sea scorpion," Nova whispered, her excitement gone. "A eurypterid. They've been extinct for hundreds of millions of years, and never this size. It must be at least 5 meters long." The creature moved with shocking speed for its size, orienting toward the light of the submersible. Before anyone could react, it shot forward and seized the small craft between its massive claws. The feed showed a blur of movement, then the horrible sight of those claws tightening. The metal of the submersible crumpled like paper, and the feed went dead with a burst of static. "Cut the feed," I ordered immediately, my training taking over despite the horror churning in my stomach. "Seal all access points to the drilling area now. Full lockdown protocols." I hit the emergency containment button, sending the alarm through the entire habitat. "I want every bulkhead between us and that breach locked down and pressure checked." The crew sprang into action, the blaring alarms driving home the urgency of our situation. As I initiated the emergency protocols, I couldn't shake the image of what we'd just witnessed. A prehistoric nightmare that should have been long extinct, now fully awake and aware of our presence. I watched in stunned horror as the creature, this impossible monstrosity, oriented itself toward the opening to our habitat. Its segmented body contorted, compressing as it forced its massive bulk through the breach we'd created. What should have been physically impossible happened before my eyes. 5 meters of prehistoric nightmare squeezing through with alarming speed and purpose. The blare of emergency alarms jolted me from my frozen state. Red warning lights flashed throughout the corridor, bathing everything in a pulsing crimson glow. "Move! Everyone to Central Command!" I shouted, turning to run down the main passage. The corridor filled with crew members stumbling in shock and confusion. I spotted Monica Wells clutching her arm, blood seeping between her fingers from a gash likely sustained when the initial alarms triggered. "Here, lean on me," I said, supporting her weight as we moved. "Keep pressure on that." She nodded wordlessly, face pale with shock. I guided her forward, passing her off to Barry Chen, who met us at the junction to Section C. "Get her to medical," I ordered, continuing my sprint towards Central Command. Up ahead, Gregory Jacobs worked the manual override for one of the pressure doors, the muscles in his forearms straining as he cranked the mechanism. "Engineering sealed," he called out as I approached. "Most of the crew is ahead." A violent screech of tearing metal cut through the alarm's wail, the sound so distinct and horrifying it made my skin crawl. It came from deeper within the station, from the direction of our living quarters and maintenance bays. Gregory's eyes widened. "That's Module D. The seal didn't hold." His voice barely carried over the cacophony of alarms and the distant sound of metal giving way. "Maintenance Team B was running diagnostics there," I said, the implication hitting us both simultaneously. We sprinted to Central Command, the reinforced doors sliding open. Inside, chaos reigned. Crew members huddled in groups, some shouting while others sat in silence. The command center's screens displayed various sections of the habitat, some showing only static where camera feeds had been lost. Drew stood at the main console, his face taut with tension. "Status report now," he barked as I entered. "What the hell is that thing and how did it get in?" "It forced its way through the breach," I reported, moving to the monitoring station. "It shouldn't have been able to fit, but it did." Tiffany Mejia sat at the communications console, her fingers flying across the interface. "Mayday, Mayday. This is Poseidon 7 requesting immediate evacuation. We have a severe breach and an unknown hostile entity has entered the habitat." She paused, listening to the empty static. No response from the surface. The storm might be blocking transmission. Genesis Young approached from the security station, her face grim. "Maintenance Team B isn't responding to any calls. Their comm signals are offline." She pulled up a schematic of the habitat on the main screen, highlighting Module D in flashing red. Last contact had them running system checks in the environmental control room. I turned to the array of internal camera feeds, scanning for any sign of the creature. The footage from Module D showed flooding in the lower sections, but the emergency barriers had engaged, containing the worst of it. Then movement caught my eye. "There," I pointed to the third screen from the left. The creature moved through the module with unsettling purpose. Its segmented body glided through the water, despite its size. What chilled me most wasn't its prehistoric look or huge claws. It was how it moved. Not randomly, but with a clear intent. Its multiple eyes scanned everything, taking in details of our habitat. "Where's Jeffrey, Susan, and Everett?" I asked, scanning the footage for any sign of the maintenance team. Grace joined me at the monitors, her face pale. "They should be visible in Section D7, near the environmental controls." We scrolled through every available camera angle. Nothing. No bodies, no survivors, just empty corridors and the massive creature exploring our habitat. "It's moving with purpose," Nova whispered, her curiosity pushing aside her fear. "See how it's examining everything?" She was right. The creature paused near an electrical junction, where power conduits from the main generator fed into Module D's systems. Its antennae quivered, extending toward the humming panels. The creature moved closer, its appendages skimming across the hardware. "The electrical output," I said, realizing. "Look at how it's reacting to the energy signatures." The creature's antennae moved faster as they got closer to the high-voltage equipment, as if it was sensing the electrical field. "It's attracted to our systems," I said, my mind racing. "Look how it reacts to different outputs. The lighting barely registers, but the junction panel has its full attention." Drew turned to me. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying it's responding to electrical energy. That might be our only advantage." I pointed to the screen where the creature was now investigating a power coupling. "It's not just randomly destroying things. It's drawn to power sources. We might be able to use that." I watched the creature move to another power conduit, its segmented claws probing the metal housing as if it knew what it was looking for. Each movement showed an unsettling intelligence. The thing was 5 meters long, its armored exoskeleton gleaming under our emergency lights as it investigated the junction box with purpose. The overhead lights suddenly flickered, dimming for just a few seconds before stabilizing again. The reaction was immediate. The creature's entire body tensed, and it attacked the power conduit with renewed vigor, pincers striking the metal with enough force to dent the reinforced housing. I stepped back from the monitoring station, not wanting to believe what I was seeing. "It responds to power fluctuations," I said to no one in particular, my voice barely audible over the alarms still blaring through Central Command. Grace moved beside me at the console. "You think it can sense electrical currents?" "Look at it," I pointed as the creature tore into the conduit, exposing a bundle of cables. "It's not just destroying things randomly, it's targeting our power grid." Over the next 6 hours, our situation worsened. The creature broke into Module C, ripping through a maintenance access point connected to the power distribution network. The pressure alarms blared as that section failed, and we had to seal it off completely. By hour 3, it had found its way into Module E, where our secondary life support systems were housed. I stood helplessly at the monitoring station, watching through camera feeds as it systematically destroyed connection points, ripping through circuitry with surgical precision. "We need to retreat further in," Drew ordered, his face pale as he watched the feeds. "Central Command isn't going to hold if that thing keeps working its way through our systems." We had no choice but to move deeper into the habitat's core, gathering what supplies we could carry. 16 of us crowded into the innermost section, designed as a final emergency shelter. The space wasn't meant to hold so many for long, but it was our only option as the creature methodically cut off our escape routes one by one. It was Monica who suggested the desperate plan. "The auxiliary submersible in Bay 2 might still be accessible through the maintenance tunnel," she said, pulling up the schematics on her tablet. "If a small team could reach it, we could at least get a distress call out before the communications array fails completely." I studied the route she indicated. It was risky. The tunnel would take them dangerously close to where the creature had last been spotted. But with our systems failing and oxygen levels already dropping, we were running out of options. "I'll go," Monica volunteered. Gordon, Jeffrey, Marcus, and Ashlyn quickly joined her. I wanted to object. Sending anyone out there felt like a death sentence. But we needed that submersible if any of us were going to survive. We gave them handheld lights and emergency breathers, then watched them enter the maintenance access hatch. For 20 minutes, we tracked their comm signals, tensing each time they went silent for more than a few seconds. They made it within 30 meters of the submersible bay when Monica's voice came through in a panicked burst. "It's here! It came through the—" Her words cut off in a scream that turned my blood cold. We heard Marcus shouting something about the emergency hatch, then Gordon yelling for Jeffrey to move faster. The comms erupted with overlapping voices and the horrible sound of tearing metal. Then Ashlyn's voice, clearer than the others. "Seal the tunnel behind us. It's coming through." Her words ended in static. The life sign monitors on our screens flatlined one after another. 5 more lives gone in less than a minute. No one spoke as we stared at the dead comm lines. 5 more friends gone. 5 more names to add to the list of casualties. I closed my eyes, trying to breathe, fighting against the weight of responsibility that threatened to paralyze me. When I opened my eyes again, I forced myself to focus on the monitoring screens, watching the creature's movements after the attack. It hadn't returned to the breach in the drill site as I'd expected. Instead, it continued moving through the habitat, targeting junction boxes and power relays. "It's not just attacking us," I said slowly, piecing together what I was seeing. "It's systematically destroying our habitat systems." I pulled up the feed from Module F, which we'd evacuated early on. The creature had torn through there hours ago, but now it showed no interest in returning. Something clicked in my mind. "Look at this," I called to the others, pointing at the screen. "We powered down Module F completely after evacuation to conserve energy. Notice how it hasn't gone back there since." Drew leaned in. "What are you suggesting?" "I think it follows energy signatures," I explained, pulling up multiple feeds side by side. "Watch its movement pattern. It's consistently heading toward active systems. When we shut down Module F, it lost interest completely." Nova pushed her way to the front, her eyes narrowing as she studied the creature's movements. "You're right. It's not random at all." She took over the console, reviewing footage from earlier attacks, slowing down the video to analyze the creature's behavior. "I know what this is," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "It's a Eurypterid, a sea scorpion, but they've been extinct for millions of years." "Clearly not all of them," Grace said, her voice tight with tension. "It must have been trapped in that underwater cavern we breached," Nova said, her curiosity pushing aside her fear. "An isolated ecosystem, preserved for millions of years until we drilled into it." "But why is it attacking us?" Grace asked, the question hanging in the air between us. Nova turned to me with a grim expression. "Two possibilities. Either it's territorial and sees us as invaders, or..." She hesitated. "Or what?" Drew demanded. "Or it sees our electrical systems as a threat," Nova said. "Many ancient marine species were sensitive to electrical fields. They used them for hunting and navigation. Our habitat must look like a huge electrical anomaly to a creature that's never encountered human technology." As I processed Nova's words, a terrible realization began to form in my mind. If the creature was drawn to our electrical systems, following energy signatures throughout the habitat, then there was only one way to make it lose interest in us. "We need to shut everything down," I said, the weight of the decision already settling on my shoulders. "Every system, every light, every power source, complete darkness." The implications hit me all at once. No heat, minimal air circulation, no communications. But as I looked at the screens showing the creature tearing through another power junction, I knew we had no other choice. It was either that, or wait to be picked off one by one as our habitat failed around us. "We need to power down completely," I said, the words hanging in the tense air of Central Command. "Everything. Main systems, auxiliary power, communications, all of it." The suggestion was met with stunned silence. 15 faces stared back at me, expressions ranging from disbelief to terror in the harsh glow of emergency lighting. Drew stepped forward, his brow furrowed with concern. "That's suicide, Mike. We need life support. We need communications to call for help." "The creature is hunting electrical signatures," I explained, keeping my voice steady despite the urgency pounding in my chest. "Every system we keep running is basically a beacon drawing it straight to us." I moved to the main console, pulling up the schematics of our habitat. "Look, we can run minimal systems on isolated battery reserves, just enough to maintain basic life support. No external emissions, nothing that broadcasts our location." "And how long will those batteries last?" Drew asked, crossing his arms. 3 days, maybe 4 if we're careful," I answered honestly. Tiffany spoke up from the communication station. "What about calling for help? Without comms, nobody will know we're in trouble down here." "Nobody can hear us anyway," I reminded her. "The storm up there is blocking all transmissions, remember?" Even as the words left my mouth, a violent impact shook the room. The metal walls groaned under tremendous pressure. "It's testing our defenses," Nova whispered, her eyes fixed on the external camera feed. "It's methodical." I turned to face the main viewport screen. The creature was circling back around, its segmented body moving with unnerving purpose through the wreckage of Module E. The exoskeleton gleamed unnaturally in our floodlights, and its massive claws tested various sections of our remaining habitat. "I'm not suggesting this lightly," I said to the room, "but we're broadcasting our location with every system that's still running. We're ringing the dinner bell." Drew ran a hand over his face. "How do we know it will even work? That this thing will just lose interest if we go dark?" "We've been tracking its movements," I explained, pulling up the security footage from the past hours. "It consistently moves toward our highest power outputs. It ignored Module F after we powered it down. This is our only chance." Our debate was cut short by an ear-splitting screech of metal. The creature had moved out of camera range, but the sound told us everything we needed to know. It was trying to breach Central Command directly. I pointed to the pressure door leading to the main corridor. "It's coming. Right now." The massive, reinforced door visibly dented inward, the metal groaning under immense pressure. The sound sent a wave of panic through the room. "God help us," Genesis whispered. Drew's resolve crumbled as he watched the door bend. "Do it," he said quietly. "Shut it down. All of it." I turned to the 16 remaining crew members. Their faces were pale, exhausted, and terrified. These were the survivors, all that remained of our original team. "Listen carefully," I said, keeping my voice low and steady. "We're going to shut down everything except essential life support on isolated batteries. No emissions, no communications, no regular lighting. We'll seal ourselves in here and go completely dark." Gregory frowned. "For how long?" "Until it loses interest or help arrives," I answered honestly. "Maybe a few days." Leroy Dunn stepped forward, his medical officer's uniform stained with blood from treating the wounded. "Without heating systems, the temperature will drop quickly. We're 3,000 feet underwater. It's near freezing outside the habitat." "I know," I acknowledged with a grim nod. "But we have emergency thermal gear, survival blankets. We'll huddle together for body heat if necessary." "And if this doesn't work?" Grace asked quietly. Another impact hit the door, harder this time. The metal bulged inward another few inches. "We don't have other options," I said bluntly. "This is it." The crew moved with renewed urgency. Tiffany and Barry distributed thermal blankets and emergency heat packs from the supply lockers. Grace and Genesis gathered the remaining water rations and emergency food supplies. Gregory and Remy checked the battery levels on our emergency systems. I watched the creature's massive claw hammer against our door again. The reinforced steel, designed to withstand crushing ocean pressures, was buckling. We had minutes, not hours. My hands moved across the master control panel, preparing the shutdown sequence. I entered the override codes, bypassing safety protocols designed to prevent exactly what I was about to do. "Everyone, get what you need now," I called out. "Once we go dark, we stay dark. No flashlights, no tablets, nothing that emits any kind of electrical signature." The crew worked frantically, gathering supplies and securing loose items. Leroy distributed thermal clothing while Paisley and Benjamin sealed the emergency hatches. James and Priya secured the limited medical supplies we had left. "Status?" I asked, fingers hovering over the final command sequence. "Ready," Gregory confirmed. "Isolated life support is prepped and shielded." "Emergency supplies distributed," Leroy reported. Another impact. The door wouldn't hold much longer. "Everyone into position," I ordered. "Huddle together near the center of the room, away from the walls and doors." The 16 of us gathered in a tight cluster. I could feel the tremors of fear passing through the group, the quick, shallow breathing of people facing their mortality. "On my mark," I said, one hand on the console, the other holding the manual override key. 3. The creature slammed into the door again. A hairline fracture appeared in the reinforced steel. 2. The emergency lights cast long shadows across frightened faces. In that moment, I carried the weight of every life in the room. 1. I pressed the master control and turned the key. The habitat systems responded immediately. The lights went out, leaving us in darkness. The air circulation stopped. The machinery fell silent. The minimal life support indicators glowed for a few seconds longer, casting a blue tint across my crew's faces before they too went dark. We were in complete darkness. The only sounds were our breathing and the creaks of the habitat shifting. Outside, something massive moved, listening and hunting. And then we waited, suspended in darkness 3,000 feet beneath the surface of the ocean. The darkness was absolute. I pressed between Grace and Gregory, our shoulders touching as we huddled like penguins in the Antarctic. With all systems powered down, the temperature inside our underwater home dropped fast. I could feel the body heat of 15 other people around me, all that remained of our crew. "How long do you think we can last like this?" Grace whispered, her breath warm against my ear. "As long as we need to," I said, though I wasn't sure that was true. We'd been in darkness for just over 24 hours now. The central module, never designed for 16 people to camp out in, felt both cramped and eerily vast in the darkness. I knew Drew sat somewhere to my right, Nova and Tiffany beyond him. Remy and Genesis had positioned themselves near what used to be the main exit. Though what good guard duty did in pitch blackness, I couldn't say. Leroy had insisted on keeping the medical supplies within arm's reach. The others, Paisley, Barry, Sadie, Richard, Benjamin, Priya, and James, formed a rough circle with us, everyone touching at shoulders, knees, or backs. Something scraped against the outer hull, a sound like metal dragging across metal. Everyone went still. Even our breathing seemed to pause. It was out there, hunting, searching. The scraping moved slowly around the circumference of our module. I imagined its armored body sliding against our walls, those terrible claws testing for weakness. The sound faded, then returned from another direction. "It's trying to find a way in," Barry said, his voice barely audible. "It's looking for power sources," I corrected, speaking just loud enough for those nearest to hear. "As long as we stay dark, we're just another part of the structure to it." I hoped that was true. Had to be true. By the second day, the cold had worked its way deep into my bones. We rotated positions regularly, letting different people take turns in the middle of our huddle where it was warmest. The emergency thermal blankets helped, but they weren't meant for extended use in near-freezing temperatures. My fingers had gone from painful to worryingly numb. "Time for the check," I said, unfolding myself from the group. This had become my ritual every hour, checking the isolated battery reserves that powered our air scrubbers and minimal life support. The small display gave off the faintest green glow, just enough to read the numbers. I kept my body hunched around it to contain even that tiny light. 76%, I reported when I returned to the huddle. Air quality holding. "How many days is that?" Drew asked. Even his voice had lost its usual commanding tone. 4, maybe 5 if we're careful. The creature seemed most active at night, though down here night was just a concept we maintained with our watches. Its movements followed patterns, 20 to 30 minutes of activity followed by longer periods of silence. During those active phases, the sounds it made reminded me of someone methodically testing every inch of a locked door. I lay awake during the second night, listening to those sounds. A rhythmic tapping traveled across the ceiling of our module. Tap, 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 then silence, then 3 more taps. Almost like it was counting, almost like it was thinking. "You awake?" Grace whispered next to me. "Hard to sleep through that," I said. "What do you think it wants?" I didn't answer right away. The truth was too frightening to voice. "I think it's curious. Maybe it sees us as competition or a threat. Do you think it can get in?" Before I could answer, something slammed against the hull with such force that I felt the floor vibrate beneath us. Several people gasped. Someone, I think it was Priya, let out a small, choked cry. 1, 2, 3, 4. I counted silently, focusing on the numbers rather than the fear. 5, 6, 7. Another impact, harder this time. The entire habitat groaned under the stress. 8, 9, 10, 11. A third impact, then silence. I reached 20 in my count before allowing myself to breathe normally again. This had happened before. The creature would hit the habitat a few times, wait for a response, then move on when it got nothing. "It's testing us," Nova whispered from across the huddle. "Looking for a reaction." "Well, it's not getting one," Remy said firmly. By the 3rd day, the cold had become our constant companion. Breathing hurt. Each inhale felt like tiny needles in my lungs. My fingers had lost almost all feeling, and I had to concentrate to make them work when checking the battery levels. 59%, I reported after the morning check. Still within acceptable range. "Define acceptable," Paisley said, her southern accent thicker with exhaustion. "Means we're not dead yet," Barry answered before I could. We spoke less as the 3rd day wore on, partly to conserve oxygen, partly because there wasn't much to say. Occasionally someone would whisper something essential, a request to shift positions, a report from those keeping watch. But otherwise, we existed in a bubble of shared silence and shared fear. Leroy insisted we all move regularly despite the cold, to prevent blood clots and circulation problems. Every few hours he'd guide us through simple exercises we could do while seated. "Wiggle your toes," he'd instruct quietly. "Now your fingers. Roll your shoulders." Simple movements that sent fresh waves of pain through my numb extremities. The habitat shook violently during what must have been the 3rd night. I woke from a light doze to feel the floor bucking beneath me. The creature slammed against us with renewed fury, impacts coming faster and harder than before. 1, 2, 3. I counted, mouth dry with fear. The impacts continued longer than ever before. I reached 50 in my count before they began to slow, 60 before they stopped altogether. "Everyone okay?" I asked when I was sure it had moved away. Murmurs of acknowledgement circled our huddle. "Battery check," I said, unwilling to wait for the regular hourly schedule after such an attack. The faint green glow of the display showed 53%. Our air was noticeably thinner now. Each breath took more effort, delivered less satisfaction. "We may need to consider options soon," Drew whispered when I returned. He'd moved next to me in the last rotation. "Not yet," I said. "It might lose interest if we just hold out a little longer." As if to mock me, a new sound started. A slow, methodical tapping directly below where we sat. Tap, tap, tap. We all pressed closer together, no one speaking now. I felt Sadie trembling against my left side, heard Richard's ragged breathing behind me. Tap, tap, tap. I counted the seconds between each set of taps. 15. Always 15. Too regular to be random. The creature was learning something, testing something. For hours we took turns sleeping while others kept watch. Though watch meant only listening in the perfect darkness. Real sleep was impossible with the creature so close, with the cold so deep, with the air so thin. I dozed in fragments, never more than 20 minutes at a stretch. When I woke from one such doze, the tapping had stopped. I strained my ears but heard nothing. The habitat seemed to hold its breath along with us. "Is it gone?" James whispered from somewhere across the huddle. No one answered. We'd been fooled before by temporary retreats. I carefully extracted myself from the huddle, fingers so numb I had to watch my movements to make sure I was actually touching what I intended to touch. The battery display showed 47%. As I made my way back to the group, my foot caught on something. Someone's leg, probably, and I stumbled. My hand shot out instinctively to catch myself against the wall. The cold metal of the hull burned against my palm. Not with heat, but with cold so intense it felt like fire. I pulled back quickly, but not before feeling something else. A vibration, faint but distinct, rhythmic, like something large moving away through water. I rejoined the huddle, finding my place between Grace and Gregory again. "It's still out there," I whispered, "but I think it's moving away for now." We pressed together, 16 people breathing slowly in the dark, listening to the sounds of our damaged home and the creature that hunted us. I checked my watch. 3 days exactly since we'd powered down. 3 days in darkness. 3 days of cold. 3 days of fear. And still we waited, not knowing if we'd outlast the thing outside, or if our own dwindling resources would claim us first. By the 4th day, the tapping sounds against the hull had become less frequent. Each impact was more spaced out, with hours passing between the metallic rings that had once come every few minutes. The silence gave us small pockets of hope. "You hear that?" I whispered to Nova, my voice hoarse from disuse and dehydration. "The lack of sound?" "Yes," she whispered back from somewhere to my left. Nova monitored our external sensors on passive mode, the only equipment we kept running on minimal battery power. The sensors didn't emit energy the creature could detect. They only received data, making them our safest view of the outside. We spent the day in silence, tracking the pattern of impacts. Our bodies pressed together for warmth, but it faded as our temperatures dropped in the cold. On the 5th day, Nova pulled herself from our group and crawled toward me. I felt her hand touch my arm before she spoke. "Mike," she said softly, her voice barely audible. "The readings are clear. It's gone back to the cavern. Based on movement patterns and energy signatures, I'm certain it's lost interest in us." I sat up slowly, my joints aching from days of minimal movement. "You're sure?" "As sure as I can be. The passive sonar shows movement patterns consistent with retreat. Nothing has approached the habitat in 18 hours. I considered our options carefully. The habitat's battery reserves were critically low. We couldn't remain in darkness much longer without risking complete system failure. Our air quality had been steadily declining, and the temperature inside had dropped to levels that threatened hypothermia. "We need to restore power," I said. "Limited systems only. We'll start with minimal heat and air circulation, but keep external emissions as low as possible." I crawled to the main console, my movements clumsy from cold and exhaustion. Finding the system panel by touch, I entered the restart sequence I'd memorized years ago, but never expected to use. The code was designed for emergency recovery after catastrophic failure, exactly what we faced now. The overhead lights stayed off as requested, but I felt the vibration as systems began to restart. The air circulation fan started up, followed by the warming of the thermal regulators. "Everyone stay where you are," I called out. "We're bringing essential systems online, but we need to keep power usage minimal." As blood began flowing more freely to my extremities, the pain was immediate and intense. My fingers burned as circulation returned, the sensation like thousands of tiny needles pushing underneath my skin. I bit my lip to keep from making noise, tasting blood. Around me, I heard similar soft gasps and stifled sounds of discomfort as the others experienced the same painful return of circulation. The thin emergency thermal blankets rustled as people shifted positions for the first time in days. The habitat creaked as metal expanded with the heat. Each sound made me tense, waiting to see if the creature would return, drawn by our reactivated systems. After 30 minutes without incident, I risked turning on a single low-powered light in the command center. The dim illumination felt blinding after days in total darkness. I looked around at the survivors, 16 people with sunken eyes, chapped lips, and the hollow stare of those who'd seen too much horror. "The habitat can't sustain us," I announced, getting straight to the point. "The structural integrity is compromised in multiple sections, and our life support systems are running on backup power that won't last. We need to prepare the auxiliary submersible for evacuation." No one argued. They'd all seen the damage reports before we'd shut down, and the days in darkness had only worsened our situation. The auxiliary submersible was our only viable escape option, a small transport vessel meant for emergency evacuations that could hold 20 people at maximum capacity. "Gregory," I said, turning to our remaining engineering specialist, "I need you to help me check the submersible's oxygen systems. They'll need calibration for 16 people." He nodded, his face gaunt but determined. "I'll gather the diagnostic tools." I turned to Drew and Grace. "We need to inventory and load all essential supplies, water, rations, and emergency equipment. Be conservative. Weight and space are critical factors." "Understood," Grace said, her voice rough from disuse. Drew simply nodded and followed her toward the storage compartments. I looked toward our medical officer. "Leroy, have James and Priya secure all necessary medical supplies. Focus on decompression sickness treatment and hypothermia management." "Already on it," Leroy replied, gesturing for James and Priya to follow him to the medical bay. With the others dispatched to their tasks, I returned to the command console and pulled up the navigation charts. The submersible would need to ascend slowly to avoid giving us all decompression sickness. At our current depth, we'd need multiple stops on the way up. I ran calculations, factoring in our oxygen, battery power, and ascent path, each variable balanced against the others. A slow ascent would exhaust our oxygen before we reached the surface. A fast one risked decompression sickness. The submersible's power would be strained to maintain life support during the journey. While working on the calculations, I kept glancing at the external sensor readings, watching for any sign the creature might be returning. So far, Nova's assessment held true. It seemed to have lost interest in us once we no longer emitted significant electrical signals. After 4 hours of preparation, I joined Gregory at the submersible access port. The small craft was docked in a specialized chamber that could be sealed and pressurized independently from the rest of the habitat. Gregory had the access panel open, his hands moving methodically through the oxygen system check. "How's it looking?" I asked. Gregory glanced up briefly. "The primary tanks are at 98% capacity. The scrubbers need recalibration for 16 people, but they'll manage. It's going to be tight in there, though." I nodded. The submersible was designed to hold 20 people for short evacuations, not 16 for a prolonged ascent with decompression stops. "We'll make it work. We don't have another option." After helping Gregory complete the oxygen system checks, I moved on to test the communication systems. The submersible had its own independent comm array, but I kept the power settings at absolute minimum, just enough to detect nearby vessels once we neared the surface, but not enough to broadcast a strong signal that might attract unwanted attention from below. The habitat groaned as stress fractures spread where the creature had damaged support structures. Twice, we heard metal give way in the outer modules, followed by the sound of bulkhead seals engaging to contain the breaches. Grace and Drew returned from their supply run, carrying what looked like carefully measured containers and equipment. "We've prioritized water, high-calorie rations, and thermal blankets," Grace reported. "Everything's been weighed and distributed to maintain proper balance in the submersible." Drew looked exhausted, but nodded in agreement. "We've also included minimal communication equipment and emergency flares for surface signaling." By the time artificial nightfall arrived, indicated only by our watches since we'd maintained minimal lighting throughout the day, all preparations were complete. The submersible was loaded with supplies, its systems checked and rechecked, and our departure plan finalized. I gathered everyone in the command center for a final briefing. Their faces showed fatigue but also relief that we were taking action rather than waiting for the habitat to fail around us. "The plan is straightforward," I explained. "We board the submersible at 0600 hours. Detachment sequence will begin immediately after sealing. Our ascent will include 7 decompression stops, each lasting between 40 minutes and 2 hours, depending on depth. Total ascent time is approximately 15 hours if everything goes according to plan." I pulled up a simple diagram I'd prepared showing the ascent trajectory. "Once we reach near surface depths, we'll attempt to establish communication with any vessels in the area. If we can't make contact, we have enough reserve power and supplies to travel submerged for approximately 70 nautical miles toward the nearest shipping lane." The plan wasn't perfect, but it represented our best hope for survival in the crushing depths. No one raised objections. We'd all seen enough to know that staying meant certain death, either from system failure or the creature's return. "Get some rest," I concluded. "Tomorrow we leave this place behind." I shepherded our group toward the auxiliary submersible's access port, trying to project a confidence I didn't entirely feel. The narrow corridor leading to the docking bay felt even smaller with 16 people filing through it. We'd loaded the supplies earlier, water, rations, medical equipment, but now came the most critical cargo, us. "Single file," I said, standing at the hatch entrance. "Watch your head when you enter. The clearance is lower than standard." One by one, I guided my colleagues inside. Grace first, then Gregory, Nova, Barry, Paisley. Each face showed a mix of exhaustion and desperate hope as they ducked through the hatch. Drew paused beside me before entering. "How many people was this thing designed for?" he asked, eyeing the cramped interior. 8, I answered. "Maybe 10 in an emergency." I didn't need to state the obvious, that 16 was well beyond capacity. He nodded grimly and climbed inside without another word. The submersible's interior was a tight maze of bodies and equipment. I'd spent the last hour reconfiguring the seating arrangement, removing non-essential components to create just enough space for everyone. The oxygen systems had been calibrated for double capacity, but I knew we'd be cutting it close. "Secure yourselves wherever you can find space," I told them as I squeezed toward the control console. "We won't have room to move around during ascent." Genesis and Remy were the last to board. I nodded toward the airlock controls. "Seal it," I said. "Double-check the pressure gauge." They moved quickly, their training clear in their actions. Genesis worked on the primary lock, while Remy checked the seal. In the cramped space, they stayed focused. I turned to the control panel and began the pre-launch diagnostics. The submersible's systems were basic but functional. Navigation, life support, communications, propulsion. I checked each one methodically while the others settled in around me. The process took longer than usual. The systems hadn't been used in months. While waiting for the diagnostic cycle to finish, I looked out the viewport. The habitat's lights were on minimal power, casting weak beams into the darkness. Something moved at the edge of the light, a shape slipping through and vanishing. My stomach tightened. I focused, tracking the movement and catching glimpses of what looked like a segmented appendage sliding through the dark. "Mike, everything okay?" Grace asked from behind me. I pulled my eyes away from the viewport. Everyone was watching me, faces drawn with tension and exhaustion. Telling them what I'd seen would only add to their fear. "Diagnostics are almost complete," I said instead. "We're looking good so far." The console beeped, showing all systems operational. I released a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. "Genesis, Remy. How's that airlock?" I called over my shoulder. "Sealed and pressure tested," Genesis confirmed. "Double-checked and locked down," Remy added. I nodded and turned to address everyone. 16 faces looked back at me, packed so tightly they could barely move. Friends and colleagues who'd survived days of darkness and terror. People who were counting on me to get them to safety. "Everyone secured?" I asked, scanning the cabin. Murmurs of confirmation rippled through the group. "We have a long ascent ahead. We'll need to make several decompression stops to avoid the bends. Total transit time will be about 12 hours if all goes well." I didn't mention what would happen if things didn't go well. They already knew. "Starting detachment sequence," I announced, turning back to the console. I entered the command codes and initiated the release procedure. The submersible's clamps disengaged from the docking port with a series of metallic clanks that resonated through the hull. "Releasing docking clamps," I said, my voice steady, preparing for separation. The final latch released, and the submersible shuddered violently. Several people gasped. The craft swayed as it floated free from its housing. "Normal separation turbulence," I assured them, though the shaking was worse than I expected. The damaged habitat was likely affecting the docking mechanisms. I engaged the thrusters at minimal power, just enough to guide us away from the habitat. The craft responded sluggishly, the extra weight of our overcapacity crew affecting its handling. "Beginning ascent protocol," I said, adjusting our orientation to point upward at a gentle angle. "First stop will be at 2,700 feet. As we pulled away, I allowed myself one last look at Poseidon 7 through the viewport. The habitat looked broken and dark, with only a few emergency lights still functioning. Then I saw it, the massive shape moving around the structure. The Eurypterid, its segmented body coiled around one section of the habitat before sliding toward the breach our drilling had created. I watched as its enormous form disappeared into the opening, returning to the ancient cavern we never should have disturbed. I said nothing about what I'd seen and focused on the controls. We needed to conserve power. I set our systems to use minimal energy to extend our battery life and to avoid detection if the creature decided to follow. "Settling in for the ascent," I said. "Everyone try to stay as still as possible. We need to conserve oxygen." The craft climbed slowly through the crushing depths. At our first decompression stop, I held our position, monitoring the pressure gauges carefully. Inside the cabin, no one spoke. The only sounds were the soft hum of the life support systems and the occasional creaking of the hull as pressure changed. The next hours passed in tense silence. The oxygen situation became more evident as time went on. The air grew increasingly stale despite the scrubbers working at full capacity. We'd all agreed to limit communication to necessary exchanges only. "How are we doing?" Drew whispered after our third decompression stop. "On schedule," I replied quietly. "Oxygen at 64%. We're good." That wasn't entirely true. We were just barely within acceptable parameters, but telling them that wouldn't help anyone. I kept the sonar on its lowest power setting during the ascent. Every few minutes, I checked the display for any sign of movement below us. Each scan showed only empty water, but I couldn't shake the sense that we were being followed. After our 6th decompression stop, Gregory leaned forward slightly. "What depth are we at?" he asked, his voice barely audible. 800 feet, I answered. 2 more stops to go. I didn't mention the significance of this depth, but I knew it, and I suspected Nova did too. Based on what we knew of Eurypterids and the pressure readings from the cavern, 800 feet likely marked the upper limit of the creature's habitat. Any prehistoric organism adapted to that pressure would struggle to follow us higher. I kept checking the sonar anyway, my eyes flicking between the display and the navigation controls. The next hours crawled by with excruciating slowness. The air grew thinner, faces paler. Some dozed fitfully in the cramped conditions, while others stared ahead with glassy eyes. After our final decompression stop at 100 feet, I allowed myself to believe we might actually make it. The sonar had shown nothing unusual for hours. The crushing weight of the deep ocean was behind us. "Last leg," I announced, my voice sounding rough from disuse. "We're heading to the surface." For the first time since we'd boarded the submersible 12 hours earlier, I saw something like relief on the faces around me. Grace managed a weak smile. Remy nodded once, firmly. Even Drew's perpetual frown softened slightly. "We made it past its hunting depth," Nova whispered, voicing what I'd been thinking. No one asked what it was. We all knew. As we climbed toward the surface, I felt something shift in my chest. Not hope or relief, but a small step toward believing this nightmare might finally end. I felt the submersible lurch upward with a final push, then bob sickeningly as we hit the surface. After 3 days of cramped ascent, the sudden rocking motion sent waves of nausea through my already weakened body. 16 of us packed into a space meant for 8, breathing recycled air that had grown thinner with each passing hour. But we'd made it. "We've reached the surface," I announced, my voice raspy from dehydration. The words triggered a few weak cheers, but mostly I heard exhausted sighs of relief. Nobody had energy for celebration. In the dim blue glow of the emergency lights, I could make out Grace's face, her eyes closed as she leaned back against the curved wall. Gregory sat beside her, his hand resting on her shoulder. Next to them, Nova stared blankly ahead, her usual scientific curiosity extinguished by fatigue. The others, Tiffany, Drew, Remy, Genesis, Leroy, Paisley, Barry, Sadie, Richard, Benjamin, Priya, and James, were packed together like sardines, many of them dozing in uneasy sleep. Tiffany crawled forward from her position near the communications panel. "Let me try again," she said, her fingers already working the dials. She'd been trying to establish contact every hour since we began our ascent, but the storm that had been raging above had blocked all signals. I watched her work, admiring her focus despite everything we'd been through. The cuts on her hands had scabbed over, but I knew they hurt. We all carried our wounds, visible and invisible. "This is Auxiliary Vessel Poseidon 7B requesting immediate assistance," she said into the microphone. Her voice was clear and professional, betraying none of the trauma we'd endured. 16 survivors on board. Repeat, 16 survivors requesting immediate assistance." Static crackled back at us, but then a voice broke through. "Poseidon 7B, this is cargo vessel Horizon Star. We read you. What's your situation?" Tiffany's face lit up. She looked at me, her eyes wide. "We have contact." I pulled myself forward to the mic. "Horizon Star, this is Chief Engineer Mike Reynolds of Poseidon 7. Our platform suffered catastrophic damage. We require immediate medical assistance and evacuation. 16 survivors on board. Copy that, Poseidon 7. We have your position. Altering course to intercept. ETA approximately 6 hours. Can you maintain your current position? Affirmative, I replied. We'll activate emergency beacons. Be advised, all survivors require medical evaluation for extended decompression protocol. Understood. Horizon Star out. I looked back at the others. Help is coming. 6 hours. Drew opened his eyes. Did they say which company they're with? Cargo vessel, I said. Independent, I think. Drew nodded and closed his eyes again. I understood his concern. The company that operated Poseidon 7 would have questions. Questions none of us were eager to answer. The next 6 hours dragged on. We rationed our last water, each person getting barely a mouthful. The heat inside the submersible climbed as the sun hit the metal hull. Sweat mixed with grime on our bodies, but nobody complained. We were alive. Through the small viewport, I watched the horizon, searching for any sign of our rescue. When I finally spotted a dark shape in the distance, I held my breath until I could make out the outline of a large cargo ship. They're here, I announced. The transfer from our submersible to the Horizon Star was a blur of activity. Crew members helped us up a swaying ladder one by one. I insisted on being the last to leave, watching as my team was pulled to safety. When my turn came, I gripped the metal rungs with trembling hands. My muscles screamed in protest as I forced myself to climb. The wind hit me first. Real wind, not the recycled air of the habitat or submersible. Then came the sunlight, blindingly bright after days in the dim emergency lighting. As I stepped onto the deck of the rescue ship, the enormity of what we'd survived crashed over me. I took my first breath of fresh air in months and felt my legs give way beneath me. Someone caught me before I hit the deck. The sky stretched endlessly above, so open and vast it made my head spin. "I've got you, sir," a crew member said, supporting my weight. "Medical's this way." I couldn't stop shaking. The cold that had taken root in my body during those 5 days in darkness seemed permanent, as if I'd never be warm again. They guided me to the ship's medical bay, where the others were already being treated. The medical staff wrapped me in thermal blankets and attached monitoring equipment to check for signs of decompression sickness. "Your core temperature is dangerously low," a medic told me as she checked my vitals. "How long were you exposed to cold conditions?" 5 days without environmental systems, I said. My teeth wouldn't stop chattering. Before that, 3 days in a submersible with minimal life support. She looked alarmed and called for more blankets. "The others?" I asked. "All alive. Some cases of hypothermia, dehydration, malnutrition. 2 showing minor symptoms of decompression sickness, but they should recover." She paused. "You mentioned 16 survivors. The database shows 27 crew members assigned to Poseidon 7. I closed my eyes. "That's correct." She didn't ask more questions. In the days that followed, the Horizon Star took us back to the mainland. Company officials arrived by helicopter, men and women in suits with tablets, asking the same questions repeatedly. Where did the breach happen? What caused the system failure? Was protocol followed? They interviewed each of us separately, comparing our stories. I sat in the ship's small conference room, facing 2 company representatives, a man named Harlow and a woman called Diaz. "Let's go through the sequence again," Harlow said, his fingers poised over his tablet. "You detected an anomaly during routine drilling operations." "Yes," I said. "A hollow space approximately 30 meters below our position. I recommended we adjust our approach, which was done. After some discussion, yes. And then? The drill breached the cavity. There was immediate pressure destabilization. Multiple systems failed simultaneously, resulting in flooding of modules D, E, and F, Diaz added, reading from her notes. I nodded, sticking to the story we all agreed on. The 16 survivors decided to leave out what we found. Who would believe us? An ancient sea creature that should have been extinct for millions of years? A predator that hunted electrical energy? We'd sound crazy. The company would bury the truth anyway. The report will say the cause was a system failure from unexpected pressure changes, Harlow said, focused on his tablet. Tragic but unavoidable, Diaz added. Environmental factors we couldn't predict. I wanted to laugh. Beyond reasonable prediction. That was one way to describe a prehistoric monster that should have been extinct for millions of years. 11 crew members lost, Harlow said, reading from his tablet. Jeffrey Wilson, Susan Cho, Everett Mills, Monica Wells, Gordon Reeves, Marcus Thompson, Ashlyn Parker, David Chen, Zoe Ramirez, Rohan Patel, and Olivia Dawson. Each name hit me like a physical blow. I had been their chief engineer. Their safety had been my responsibility. You did everything you could, Mr. Reynolds, Diaz said, noticing my expression. The company recognizes your efforts in saving 16 lives under extreme circumstances. I nodded, but said nothing. They didn't want heroes or villains in their report, just an accident that couldn't have been prevented. Clean, clinical, closed. When they left, I went back to the cabin they'd given me on the ship. I turned on every light and sat on the edge of the bunk, staring at the door until morning. We reached the mainland 3 days later. The company had arranged for medical evaluations, psychological assessments, and temporary housing for all survivors. They offered us paid leave and counseling services, standard procedure following traumatic incidents. Several of my colleagues took the company shuttle to the hotel they'd arranged. I called a taxi instead. The hotel room was nice enough. Clean sheets, hot water, room service. But the first night I woke up screaming, clawing at the darkness. I'd been dreaming about those 5 days in the habitat's core, listening to the creature tap against the hull, searching for us. After that, I slept with all the lights on. The hotel staff asked questions when I requested extra lamps. I told them I was working on technical diagrams. They didn't believe me, but they brought the lamps anyway. During the day, I gave more statements to company lawyers, insurance investigators, safety board officials. Each time, I stuck to our story. System failure, pressure breach. No mention of the creature that moved with terrible purpose through our habitat, hunting us. At night, even with the lights on, I heard the tapping. Tap, tap, tap. The sound of something testing our defenses, looking for a way in. I ran into Grace at company headquarters during one of my debriefings. She looked better than the last time I'd seen her. Color had returned to her face, and she'd gained back some weight. "How are you holding up?" she asked. "I'm fine," I lied. "You?" "Getting there." She glanced around to make sure no one was listening. "Do you ever think about what it was? Really think about it?" I knew exactly what she meant. Every day. Nova has theories. She thinks it might have been down there for millions of years, trapped in that pocket. Dormant until we woke it up. "Does it matter what it was?" I asked. Grace studied my face. "I guess not, but I keep wondering if there are more of them down there." I didn't answer. I'd been wondering the same thing. 1 month after our rescue, the company organized a memorial service for the 11 crew members we'd lost. It was held at a coastal park, with the ocean spread out behind the podium, where executives offered platitudes about sacrifice and courage. The families of the deceased sat in the front row, many of them crying quietly. I stood at the back, alongside the other survivors. Gregory nodded to me when I arrived. Nova was there with Remy. Drew stood apart from the rest of us, talking with company executives. Tiffany gave me a small, sad smile. As the company president spoke about the unfortunate accident that had claimed 11 brave souls, I looked past him to the ocean. The water was calm today, sunlight dancing on the surface. It looked peaceful, beautiful even, but I knew what lurked in the depths. After the service, I walked down to the shore. The waves lapped gently against the sand. A child nearby was building a sandcastle, laughing as the tide crept closer to her creation. "It never looks dangerous from here," Grace said, joining me. "No," I agreed. "It's good at hiding its secrets." We stood in silence for a while, watching the horizon. That evening in my apartment, I hadn't gone back to my old place yet, wasn't ready for that. I turned on the TV while making dinner. I wasn't really watching, just needed the noise to fill the silence. But then a phrase caught my attention. "Unusual electromagnetic disturbances detected in deep-sea communications cables." I turned up the volume. A reporter was speaking over footage of a research vessel. Thousands of miles from the recent Poseidon 7 incident, engineers report unexplained power fluctuations and signal disruptions in the Trans-Pacific cable network. Experts are attributing the phenomena to underwater seismic activity, though some scientists question this explanation given the lack of registered earthquake events in the region. The camera cut to a map showing the affected area, a section of cable in the western Pacific, far from where Poseidon 7 had been located. I sat down, slowly. My dinner forgotten. I knew what caused electromagnetic disturbances. I knew what was attracted to electrical energy, and I knew with cold certainty that the prehistoric horror we'd awakened hadn't died or returned to its sleep. It was hunting again, following the energy signatures of our underwater cable networks, moving through the depths with terrible purpose. And nobody on the surface had any idea what was coming.